I was reading the latest issue of Star Wars Insider, number 229, and I was blown away by the incredible interviews inside. I'm not going to read them verbatim, but there's some very cool stuff worth talking about. With all the recent and much-deserved buzz around Skeleton Crew, starting with the John Watts and Christopher Ford interview makes the most sense. They're the showrunners for the new series, if you don't know. In the interview, Watts reveals that the initial pitch for the series happened way back in 2017. He was out in Japan doing international press for Spider-Man Homecoming, the good old days when Marvel movies were still worth watching. The elevator pitch he offered was that the show would be a tale about a group of kids in a galaxy far, far away, seeking adventure and, for better or worse, getting what they wished for. If it wasn't for the better or worse line, I would have passed this by like it was nothing. I feel like it's probably meant a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but it does make you think if maybe not all the kids are going to look back on this with fondness. During much of the series' development, and certainly at the time of this recording, Dave Filoni is the chief creative officer at Lucasfilm. He won't be directly involved in every last decision or every last script, but he's the oversight so the saga can start to feel like it has continuity again, and ideally provide a more organized approach to the whole thing. Not only did he help Watts and Ford with the series, but Jon Favreau, creator of The Mandalorian, was around as well. That gives me a lot of faith in the series going forward, but also makes me think that the connections to the Mandoverse will be more than Vane, the Nikto pirate who's been showing up. A lot of the answers the showrunners gave revolved around the cast and characters being so young. This is their entry into the Star Wars galaxy as well as the audiences, especially for new audience members. They specified the importance of keeping the kids' knowledge limited. To paraphrase one of Watts' answers, the kids haven't seen the movies. To keep running with the theme of the core characters being kids, when asked about the tone, kid-friendly but also involving pirates who could be scary, Watts pointed out what made the classic Amblin movies that inspired this project work so well. They're not kids movies. They're great movies that happen to star kids. I love this approach, writing them as characters first and not children. Before making the show really got going, Watts had actually sat down with Richard Donner, who had a hand in countless amazing movies, but the most relevant to this conversation was he was a producer on The Goonies. He advised Watts that when casting kids, you aren't casting an actor to play a role. You're casting kids who embody the spirit of the character. They talked a little bit about a reunion where all of the kids fell into that same old role because they were at heart at least part of that person. The dialogue and quirks for each of the characters were altered to better suit the actor. Talking about the characters and who is the group leader led to some interesting reading between the lines. Ford and Watts talked about how some of the wants change over the course of the series. Wim, as an example, he wanted an adventure more than anything, but when he gets one, he realizes that it may be too much for him and he just wants to go home. They said flipping tropes like this was very appealing to them. The deeper reading that I got out of this is that Neil, who so far is the plucky best friend along for the ride and really unsure of everything, may be the breakout leader when push comes to shove. When asked about Jude Law, there was virtually no information given. They said they couldn't say much without spoilers. I don't think he's a Jedi. I have not at any point. If he's so mysterious, I'd be surprised and honestly a bit disappointed if he actually was a Jedi and that fact was spoiled in the marketing in the premiere. It was good to know that Jude Law is a fan of the franchise. I don't think that's necessary for an actor or creator to be a fan of the franchise, but it's always better when people working on a project respect it and aren't only there for a check. ILM was involved in the making of this series, as they should be. They went old school on some of the effects. They built a real ship and shot it in similar fashion to the amazing practical effects and stop-motion cinematography that holds up so well for the original movies. Watts and Ford cite this as a surreal experience, getting to see that level of Star Wars history. So far, the premiere of 2 episodes that, let's be real, is really just one long episode that they cut toward the end to get the episode count right. The show has been awesome. It's a ton of fun and feels refreshing. I'm hoping this can serve as a jumping on point for a lot of new fans, and a jumping back on point for some fans who have lost their love with some of the more recent projects. That's it for the Skeleton Crew interview. It was just a few pages in the magazine, but wait, there's more. Dee Bradley Baker sat down with Insider. If you don't know, Baker is an incredibly talented voice actor. He's done a ton of work inside and outside the franchise. Most notably, he voiced every clone trooper in animation. He was first brought in for the 2008 animated movie Star Wars: The Clone Wars. This carried him into the Clone Wars animated series and the spin-off The Bad Batch. And when I say the Clone Wars animated series, I'm talking about the 3D style animation that matches The Bad Batch and Tales of the Empire, Tales of the Jedi, all those things, not the 2D micro-series. He's also done work in Young Jedi Adventures and Lego Rebuild the Galaxy. Baker actually corrects this timeline. He saw A New Hope in 1977 as a 13-year-old and fell in love with it. He wore a homemade Jawa costume for Halloween that same year. The movie was re-released in 1978. Baker was hired by a local theater to wear his Jawa costume as a promotional stunt all summer long, making that technically his first gig in the Star Wars universe. Baker talks about the creative freedom he gets to voice new or smaller characters, as the Star Wars galaxy is so vast. The clones were an established thing. Being an established thing didn't mean it was easy, not by a long shot. They were a unique challenge since they were all the same, but they were also individuals who needed to stand out from amongst one another, at least a little bit. Not just for the audience's sake, but for Baker's own sanity. To up the difficulty further, he would read scripts and realize that the bulk of the scripts were him talking to himself. He has no other actor to play off of. He would keep logs of characters that he knew he would be revisiting in multiple episodes to more easily slip into that character. If he had to, he could have the audio engineers bring up dialogue from that character so it could re-trigger in his brain for consistency. All of this wasn't just about altering his voice slightly. He understood the clones were individual people, even if their genome was almost identical. An important distinction, as the human versus droid angle was very deliberate when George Lucas created it. One role I never would have guessed his, or any other human for that matter, did was Nix in Star Wars Outlaws. Nix is the axolotl-looking sidekick to Kay Vess. This next interview was one I was the most excited for, but I probably wouldn't have thought to ask for it before I knew it existed. Denis Lawson, Wedge Antilles, sat down to talk about his time in Star Wars. For long-term Star Wars fans, especially fans of the expanded universe, now Legends, Wedge is a top-tier character, not just a side character. Lawson's story goes back to 1976. George Lucas was in London casting pilots for a new movie. And that's all anyone knew at the time. No one knew it was space pilots or that it was called Star Wars or anything specific. He didn't even know what the pilots were going up against. He auditioned for Lucas and never heard back. That's pretty typical for an actor, so he moved on. He went and did a couple roles in France, and when he was heading back to London, he got a call from Lucasfilm that the person they cast for the role wasn't working out and asked if Lawson would step in. This next little bit isn't in the interview, but to fill in the blanks, Colin Higgins was the man originally cast to play Wedge. When shooting started, Higgins was having a hard time with the pressure of the production and couldn't get through his line. One scene Higgins shot survived. He's the one who says that the shot on the Death Star's exhaust port is impossible. His character was later called Cole Tackbright, decades later in From a Certain Point of View, and the inside joke name of fake Wedge has been thrown around a lot by the fans. Lawson likely doesn't know any of this lore, but even if he did, he's too classy a guy to bring it up in an interview. Even after he was working on the movie, Lawson and everyone involved, probably up to and including George Lucas, had no idea what a smash hit A New Hope would be. Even as he was shooting his scenes, he had not seen a full script, so he really had no idea of what he was a part of. The pilot actors were brought onto the soundstage one at a time to sit in a makeshift cockpit raised up on stilts. A few feet away was a camera and George Lucas. The expectation was that they would just rattle off their lines, pages and pages of dialogue, one after another. They had no cues, no direction, and no context. Lawson talked Lucas into reading them out to him so that he, Lawson, could repeat them back as directed. He would do a lot of lines multiple times, looking in different directions so that Lucas would have coverage to edit together seamlessly. As awkward as this process sounds like it was, for the actor, the magic of movie editing really worked on those scenes. They're tight, and it does look like the actors are interacting with their environment. Lawson even acknowledges, even at a bird's eye view, the lore that is built up around the character, and really all characters, in addition to the performance that he provided. He's happy to have been part of it and finds it surreal so many years later. Many of you know that Ewan McGregor is the nephew of Denis Lawson. The two don't talk Star Wars in the context of lore so much, but they have discussed their experiences in making the movies in the different eras. The uncle and nephew pairing did a panel at a convention along with George Lucas. The other connection Lawson talks about is less well known. Ian McDiarmid, Emperor Palpatine, helped a 17-year-old Lawson get into drama school. Lawson even laughs that after McDiarmid helped him, he figured he'd never see him again. They then spent 3 years learning together, and obviously were both a big part of Star Wars, though they probably didn't interact on set. Coming back into the Star Wars fold for conventions wasn't the last fans would see of Lawson either. He was brought back for a cameo in The Rise of Skywalker, nearly 50 years after he had first landed the role of Wedge Antilles. The cameo was actually supposed to be a small part, but Lawson was so busy with other acting projects, he only had a single day to make it happen. Say what you will about The Rise of Skywalker, but seeing Wedge back was a really cool, undeniable moment. Star Wars Insider has been a fun read. I subscribed just a couple months ago. I remember hearing about it when I was much younger and just didn't have the money for the subscription. It's not a magazine that comes every month, so coverage is going to be a little sparse. Check out this video next to dive back into Star Wars lore. Throughout the interview, Watts reveals that the initial... She's just screaming. Can I do this? Do you want a blanket? You want this? Come here, Stella.